Hi there, this is Mark Killian. Welcome to Mark Killian's channel where we're always learning. And this week we are doing a jazz harmony primer dealing with chords. I'm going to do another jazz harmony primer dealing with chord progressions. But in this episode we are dealing with chords as separate entities. How are chords constructed? What does it mean when you see a C7 or a G13 or a D sharp 9? Maybe you've never quite understood what all that means. Well, hopefully at the end of this episode you will understand exactly what all that means. So let's get started. Basically, harmony is divided into two parts, really, if you think about it. There's triadic harmony, which is triadic, made of 3 notes. That's a C major triad. And then there is harmony that is based on extensions, which means that if you add anything above that C major triad, you have an extension. Any extension requires the triad to be there. So the triad is the foundation on which the house is built. And you will find that everything we go through today is going to have as its base the triad. And the triad tells you 3 very, very important things, the most important things that give a chord its character, which is the tonic. What is the tonic? In this case, it's C. This is your do. This is your sa. This is your key center. We're going to do everything here in C, just to keep it simple, so that you can have a relative understanding of everything. So let's go back to the triad. C being our key center. E is the third. So the third can be one of 2 things. It can be major or minor. An incredibly important distinction in a chord. That is what signifies the character of a chord. If it's major, it's bright, it's open, it's happy. If it's minor, it's darker, it's sadder, blah, blah, blah. And the next note up is the 5th, which is the second most important signifier of what the character of a chord is. And the 5th can be 3 things. It can either be like it is now, natural or major, because it's a part of the C major scale. But I can lower that 5th or flatten it to that, which gives you a tritone. I can also augment it or sharpen it. And what is special about both of those chords, and of course when we get to the extensions they are incorporated in higher extended chords, but basically the building blocks are that each note of a chord is built in thirds, and you'll see as we go through all the extensions they basically all have as their glue that they're built in thirds. Now, when we flatten that 5th and get it diminished, we get that. And you have minor thirds as the intervals here. So you get from C to E flat is a minor third. From E flat to G flat is a minor third. With the augmented chord, from C to C natural is a major third. And from C natural to G sharp is a major third. And completing that from G sharp back to C is a major third. And what's special about the augmented chord is that it is equidistantly divides the octave up into 3 notes. So it is, along with the diminished chord, the only 2 chords that divide the octave up equally, equidistantly between its notes. I don't know if you know that Beatles song, Oh Darling. That song has as its opening chord a augmented chord. And an augmented chord has a lovely feeling of wanting to go somewhere also. Now, before we move on to the extensions going beyond the triad, there are 2 chords that exist within the first batch of notes here that deserve mentioning right now. One is built on the 2nd step of the scale, and one is built on the 4th step of the scale. So the 2nd step of the scale is this, and this is the chord I'm going to show you. I'm sure that's a sound that you are very familiar with in pop ballads, for example. What I'm doing there is doing a second suspension, or sus2 as it is usually written out. And what that means is that you're taking the third out. Now this is pretty much the only time, even with all the extensions, that you will omit the third. And the only reason is because the third is suspended in this case, meaning it wants to go to the third. It has a suspension. Very seldom do you find these chords just like that without resolving or going somewhere. And it's the same with the fourth. 1, 2, 3, 4. There's the fourth. The fourth is also suspended. It wants to come down to the third. You don't play the third with a fourth, with a sus4 as it's written, sus4. A great example of this is Michael Jackson's Black or White. And so what I'm doing there is, this is a sus4 chord. That's your triad. There's your G, your C, your E. I just showed it to you here in this position, but I just moved this G down here and played it there. That's called an inversion. And then, and that's the sus2. There's the 2. Now the 2 always wants to go to the third, and the 4 always wants to come down to the third. So that is the suspension chord, basically, and that fits within the framework of the triad. So another example of the sus4 chord is Elton John's Don't Let the Sun Go Down on Me. Always wants to resolve down. Another example is Billy Joel's that sound. It's a sus4 chord. It wants to go somewhere. It's a great chord. The other thing I quickly want to illustrate is what I just showed you, maybe it confused you a little bit, was a inversion. So here's your triad. I can move the C up, and now it's in the first inversion. I can move the E up to there, and now it's in second inversion. And any chord you play can be moved and have different inversions. And indeed, as we'll see later, any chord can also scramble the notes in any way you want them, and that is called voicing. How do you put that chord between your two hands? And the way a pianist voices something is going to be different than the way a guitarist is going to voice something. And of course the word voicing comes from writing for choir, because there are different voices. Your choir is broken into 4 different sections, soprano, alto, tenor, bass, and each of those sections is called a voice because they all sing the same note usually. And how do you structure that chord within the harmonic framework you're working in is called a voicing. And we'll get to more of that in more detail in a bit. Okay, so just a quick word on jazz versus pop. I've called this jazz harmony, but it really includes pop. And a lot of the examples I'm giving here are pop examples or rock examples. But as a general rule, once you get beyond triadic harmony, you're more into the jazz world. Yes, pop can go into the extension land, but it's not as frequent, whereas jazz is almost never just triadic. And suffice to say, if you study pop harmony and then try and jump into a jazz world, you're going to be completely lost, whereas the other way around is not true. So now let's get to the extensions. Now once we move on beyond this triad into extensions, every extension requires the triad to be in the chord, at least implied, not always played, but at least implied. Okay, so the next note we get to is going to be 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, which will be your A, and so that will make a 6 chord, C6. And another Beatles example. So that sound there, it's a very open, bright, almost nostalgic type of sound. Another example of the 6th chord is Blue Eyes by Elton John. Actually, the first opening note of the melody is the 6th. So the 6 is a very popular harmony in the golden years of jazz, like the 30s, 40s, 50s, the big band era. 6 is a very bold, and maybe that's why it sounds nostalgic to us today, but like, for example, Mac the Knife. That's it, that's the sound, that's 6 there. Now the 6th has a friend, the minor 6. What do I mean by that? Here's your 6. Now let's make it minor by lowering the 3rd. That's your minor 6. That's from Shine On You Crazy Diamond by Pink Floyd. It's just a major 6 chord with a lowered 3rd. Now, the next note in the scale is the 7th. Now, the 7th has a plethora of different varieties for you to play with and to confuse the shit out of you. But let's start with the one that exists in the major scale, which is the B natural. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. And that chord, again, we have our triad. Those are the notes that are required for any extension. Sound I'm sure you're familiar with. Stevie Wonder's I Just Called to Say I Love You starts out using that interval. Or this song by the Cars. That's your major 7th, written often with a triangle 7 or just with an MAG 7. Okay, now to the dominant 7th. What does that mean? That means we're flattening the 7th. Now the 7th is the B, and if we flatten it, we get a B flat. Now that is called a dominant chord, perhaps one of the most important chords in the whole arsenal of harmony, because the dominant chord is where everything wants to head to before it finally goes home and resolves. And so the dominant is there to create tension. It's always in our chord progressions and harmonic language, the device that is used to create tension. And the reason for that is because the intervals always want to go somewhere. Here's your dominant. And if you resolve this chord to, that sounds very satisfying, doesn't it? So a great example of this is the Beatles classic Hey Jude. That's your G triad. Now it's going. There it went to the dominant 7th. So and that is a very, very classic use of the dominant 7th. It's, like I say, cannot overstate how important it is. When I show you what I'm just about to show you, you'll really understand how important it is. Have you ever heard of the blues? Well, the blues basically is where rock music comes from. Not to say that rock music is always structured like the blues. It isn't. But the blues is basically built on a series of dominant harmonies. Let me just give you an example. Now, all I'm doing there is C dominant. You see I've got the B flat in there? I've moved it now, it's in a different inversion. Or I can voice it a different way, however I want to do it. Or it's all C dominant, and then it goes to the F, but it makes the F also a dominant. So if I was in F, there's my F major scale, but I'm making it dominant. I'm lowering the 7th. In other words, that E will go to an E flat. And there's your F dominant. So just to get back to the blues, here's your... That's C7 going to F7, and then it goes to the G7. And that's the basic form of the blues. I will be doing that in the next episode and looking more closely at how the blues are structured. But moving on. Now the dominant has a few variations. The first one is that the dominant can have a raised 5th. Okay, so a great example of that is When I Fall in Love. See that chord there? basically, there's your 7th, there's your root, there's your 3rd, and there is your augmented 5th. So that chord would be written C7 plus, or AUG. Now the next form of dominant 7th chord we have is called the diminished 7th. Now we looked at the diminished triad a little while ago, which is where you flatten the 3rd and flatten the 5th. But now we're going to add the 7th. But oops, wait a minute. That's a natural 7th, that's a flattened 7th, and a diminished chord is this. But that's not a 7th, you'll say, that's a 6th. Well, it is considered a 7th because it's functioning in this particular harmonic context as a 7th. And you would literally write this in music as a double flat B. So the B has been flattened twice, once to get there and once to get here. And so that's called enharmonic writing. I will be dealing with that more in depth in the next episode. Now what is special about this, as with the augmented chord, is that this chord divides the octave up into 4 equally distant notes. You've got a minor 3rd, a minor 3rd, a minor 3rd, and another minor 3rd to get back to your tonic. You will know this from, you know, horror movies from the 30s or 40s. It's the chord with maximal tension in it. And it's also used very often, and diminished 7th, as I say, circle 7 or just DIM 7 is often used for chord progressions that that move up step by step. Here's an example in a song called Bewitched. So what's happening there is I'm going from C to C sharp diminished 7th, to D minor, to D sharp diminished 7th. And what happens there is, look at these intervals. Here's your C major 7. You have these two lines, these two voices that keep resolving and wanting to go somewhere. So it creates that feeling of movement. It can also be used on progressions that move down as opposed to up like that one did. That chord there is your C sharp diminished 7th. Playing it in an inversion here, but that would be the chord. Now when I move down to a C diminished 7th, I'm just moving all the notes down by 1. And so what's nice about the diminished chord, because it divides the octave up into equal parts, you have a lot of movement possibilities with a diminished chord. Now here's a minor variant of that, which is called the half diminished chord sometimes, but more accurately called the C minor 7 flat 5. And it is, let's take the dominant 7th, that's your C7. Now all we do is make it minor and flatten the 5. And so what's different between this and the diminished 7th is just the 7th. The 7th in this one is flattened, but not double flattened. And this is a very useful and common chord to use in 2-5-1 progressions that we'll deal with in the next episode, but 2-5-1 progressions in a minor key. So let's say we're in B flat minor, and we'll go to C minor, flat 5, as the 2, and there's the 5. Here's an example of it called Bluesette. Now what happens there is you start and on C, and then when you get to the B, I've got the F in the melody, which is the flattened 5th of your B chord. So there's your B minor 7 flat 5 or half diminished, because it's a 2-5-1 going into a minor chord. The next 7th is a straight up minor 7th, which is that chord there. Does not function as a dominant chord. It's a minor chord with an extension on top of it. probably one of the more common chords, especially in pop music, that you'll find. Here's an example. And that there, the sound I'm sure you're very familiar with. And we're just about done with that bloody seventh, but not quite. Here is my favorite of all the seventh chords. Check it. It's called sometimes the Hitchcock chord because Bernard Herrmann used it in Psycho and in a lot of his writing. It is just such a great chord and has just such a statement, such an emotional, evocative statement to make, and was used a lot in cinema in the noir years. But also, he has a song that you'll recognize. I love that chord. That was Pink Floyd, Us and Them, by the way. And an interesting story about that is they actually wrote that song as a cue for a film called Zabriskie Point, for which Pink Floyd did the music. And that movie came out in 1970. And this cue that became Us and Them was rejected. And so a couple of years later, when they were working on Dark Side of the Moon, they resurrected that idea, and out came, I think, the greatest song on the album. But it's a beautiful sound. I just love that sound. Moving on. We dealt with the seventh, and after seven, what happens? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. We get back to C, which is the tonic. And when we move beyond that, we get to what you might think is now the 2 again, or the 3, or the 4, or the 5. And you'd be right, that is technically accurate. But for the purposes of chord building, we continue numbering this. So that was your seventh. This now becomes your eighth. That is an octave. And then the next one will be the ninth. And then the 10th, and the 11th, and the 12th, and the 13th. Now, we don't use 10th and 12th, and that's about it. It doesn't go beyond that. So let's start out with the major ninth. There are a couple of different versions of the ninth. And the ninth is often considered a dominant, but it's not always dominant. Here is, for example, is the major ninth, which will be written as C major 9, or with a triangle 9. So there's your major ninth, and it has all the other notes below it of the triad and the seventh. And so it's telling you that you have a major seventh with your ninth. Now you can make that a dominant ninth, in which case you take your C dominant, your C7, and then add a ninth to that. And that is, for example, in jazz, when you're playing the blues, you would voice your chords as what we call shell chords. And I'll delve more into that in the next episode. But basically, by adding the ninth, keeping the seventh, and keeping the third, because they are the most important. And if you're playing with a band, you have a bass player playing the C. You don't need to add the C into your chord. So I would voice a 9, a C7, 9, or just C9, a dominant ninth, in other words, like that. And very popular in jazz. The dominant ninth is very, very naughty in that it has two little variations that it is capable of. And one of them is to flatten the ninth, and the other one is to sharpen the ninth. Now, for example, here we are. There's our dominant ninth. I'm going to flatten the 9. It helps with voice feeling. It helps with movement. Wants to go somewhere. It really has a strong impetus to be going somewhere. The flat ninth is very much a part of your, remember I spoke about the 2-5-1 in a minor key earlier, very much a part of that progression. Let's say we're doing, we're in C minor, and here's your D, 7 flat 5, and then we go to the G7. But what happens to that A flat that we just had there? Go to the G and keep that A flat. It just adds to the tension. So that flat 5 becomes then your your flat 9 on the dominant chord. So your 2, it will be the flat 5. And in your 5, your dominant, it will be the flat 9. And that's very common in that world. The sharp 9 is also used in that same context. So instead of flattening that 9th on the G, you sharpen it. So there's your 9, you make it 1 sharper. Now what is unique about the sharp 7 chord, sorry, the sharp 9 chord, is that it has the major third, and the sharp 9 is actually the same as a minor third. So go back to C, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, and if you sharpen that, you'd say, hey, but that's a minor, that's making the chord minor. No, it's not, because you're putting the major in there, lower, somewhere. This is seen as an extension. And yes, there's a lot of tension between that and the major third. And it's a lovely chord. It's sometimes known as the Hendrix chord, because he uses it in his Purple Haze song. Also used in Pink Floyd's Shine On You Crazy Diamond, just before the guitar solo, to bring in the guitar solo. There it is. It's just so full of tension, and like I did there, often the sharp 9 chord will go down to a flat 9 to help it resolve in steps. And often mostly resolves to a minor, but not always. Now moving on, the 9th can also be a minor 9th. And in that case, we're making a C minor triad with a minor 7th, just like we did in the previous minor 7 chord, but now adding the 9th. That you will be familiar with that's Careless Whispers by George Michael. Another great example is Pink Floyd's Hey You. Is also just one of my favorite chords. I love that tonality. Before we lose the 9th, there's one little naughty 9th chord we haven't dealt with, which is a 6-9. Very naughty indeed, come to think of it. But the difference between a 6-9 chord and any of the other 9th chords we've just done is that the 6-9 chord has no 7th in it. Now that's 6-9 chord. There's your 9th, there's your 6. Not playing a 7th, and it's used a lot in bossa. Again, it's got that same opening feeling that a 6th chord has, but it adds the 9th. Now we are officially done with 9th chords. Now moving on to the 11th. 8, 9, 10, 11. Now the 11th chord is another tricksy one. There are, theoretically, you can do a major 11th chord, which would be like a major 7, add a 9th, and then add an 11th. Not very common, because you have your major 3rd and your 11th, and they don't play together very well, and then add a major 7th in there. It's not a very common chord, so I'm not going to spend any time on it. Dominant 11th, more common. But very often people will omit the 3rd. And in that case, you might ask, well, isn't that then just a sus? Not really, because you've got your 7th. But people will often write that as a G minor 7 over C. There's your G minor. G minor 7, and it's over C. And then a minor 11th which would be this. A much more agreeable sound. Don't you agree? But for this song, that harmony, these voicings here, are basically minor 11th voicings. But how it's voiced is not built upon triads, but rather built upon fourths. Let me explain. So we're in D minor here. Actually, let me go back to C. Now that voicing there, that's your C minor 11, but look how it's being voiced. You've got your C, and a fourth above that you've got your F, which is the 11th, and a fourth above that you've got your 7th, your dominant 7th, and a fourth above that you've got your minor 3rd. And then we put a 5th on the top, just because, it sounds nice. This is a what is called quartal harmony, a quartal voicing. It's based on fourths as opposed to thirds. Like pretty much everything else we've been doing today is thirds. Quartal harmony or fourths harmony, harmony built in fourths or voicings built in fourths, is something I'll explain a little more in detail in the next episode. Now going to the sharp 11, my favorite of the 11th chords. I love that sound. That's sung by Christopher Cross. I should play it in C, shouldn't I? So what we're doing there is, here's your 8, 9, 10, 11, but I'm raising that 11th and playing it like this. It's a Lydian sound. A sharpened fourth is Lydian. Go and look at my video on modes to explain that more in detail. But here's another example. That's Tears for Fears. And again, it's a Lydian chord. It's a sharp 11. I'm, in this example, not really including the 7th. I just wanted to let you hear the sound, the Lydian sound of that chord. Okay, now moving on to the 13th, which is the last stop of this train of extensions. And the 13th chord, which can also be known as the 6th, is not a 6 because it has the 7th in it. It has maybe the 9th. It maybe even has the 11th in it. So let's go. Here's your 11th. There's your 13th. So there's a dominant 13th chord. Now 13th chords as a major, not really. Possible theoretically, but you'll find a 13th chord as a dominant is the most used. In fact, in blues, how I was showing you earlier with what I called shell chord voicings, 13th is very popular. So let's say in C, that's how you'd voice a shell chord. You've got your dominant 7th, you've got your major 3rd, and then you've got your 13th up on top here. And again, this is voiced in fourths as opposed to thirds. And so when I get to there, it helps with voice leading in the case of the blues. But more on that again in the next episode. The 13th doesn't have a sharp, but the 13th can be flattened. That could also be seen in as an augmented, but again, because you're probably having the 9th and it implies that all the notes previous to 13 are part of that chord, whereas an augmented chord doesn't have a 7th, for example, doesn't have a 9th, blah, blah, blah. So this would be considered a flat 13. This would be considered an augmented. Here's an example. So this here, and you can have, I've got the 7th, I've got the 9th. I can have a flattened 9th if I want. It really just helps with the resolution and voice leading. So that pretty much wraps it up for the 13th and for the flat 13th and for indeed this entire episode. Okay, well, thank you for watching. This has been a big episode to do. A lot of stuff packed in there. I wanted to get you guys to a point where if you understand everything we've looked at today, there's pretty much nothing that a jazz chart is going to throw at you that you're not going to understand in terms of what the chords are, how to construct the chords. The next episode on this Jazz Harmony Primer is going to look at progressions and how you put all these chords together, how you weave them together in progressions, and voice leading is a part of that, and how you voice chords for different instruments is a part of that. So be sure to check out that episode, and this has been a lot of fun to make. I appreciate you guys sticking around to watch it. Take care out there, and we'll catch you next week. Booyakasha! Here's your tonic. Here's your dominant, and one of them is built on the 2nd step of the scale, and one is built on the 2nd step of the scale. What the f? And so that pretty much really? So just so if I move it to this is basically meant to deal with doing chords. No, not doing chords. That I'm basically trying. What the fuck? No, let's not say that. Bad idea. Hello, let's try that again. Let's try that again. Let's try that again. Okay, let's try that again. Okay, let's do it again. How insensitive. How insensitive of me to forget. Idiot.